January the 2nd, 1959, the rebel army entered Havana.
Because sincerely, I don't ambition power, money, nothing, only to serve my country.
Good.
As we were marching through the runway, one of the militiamen just shot the person in front of my father. And then my father was ordered to walk on top of him. And I walked on top of that dead person. And by then you had an entire line of people that were extremely devastated. We finally board the airplane. We sit down. They did not frisk me. I still had the two 18-karat gold chains in my underwear, and my father had a box of Cuban cigars with him. And we boarded the plane, and we were sitting there for about 6 hours, and no one said a word. When the engines started and the plane started to taxi, there was not a sound to be heard. When the plane finally took off, now you hear clapping, but what you heard that day were tears. Because everybody knew that they were not going back.
1959, Fidel Castro's revolution overthrew the government of Fulgencio Batista and brought hope to the majority of the island's population. Castro promised a return to the 1942 Constitution that Batista had suspended, promising free elections, political and personal liberties, and social justice. But soon, the government began to take measures that directly affected the Cuban middle class. Businesses were taken over by the state. Children were separated from parents and sent away to the countryside to work or teach peasants to read and write, and personal and political liberties gave way to arbitrary arrests, the silencing of the press, and restrictions in speech and assembly. Soon, it became clear that the Cuban government was on the road to socialism, and Cubans, afraid for their future and the future of their children, began to leave.
I think it's hard for people who have always lived in a free country to know what freedom is. It's only when you have lived in the darkness of a totalitarian regime that you understand what freedom is. You're told how to think, what to say, and if you deviate from that, you will be punished. In school, the teacher asked, which one of the two Germanys is the free Germany? And I said, the West. The teacher came and grabbed me by my ear and took me to the principal's office. And I was told to be careful how I answer questions like that. And this was early, in the early 60s. As you can see, when you live under that kind of a regime where you cannot express what you feel or even the truth, you were punished.
My parents in Cuba were extremely accomplished. My father was named the youngest superintendent of schools that the province of Matanzas ever had. And what happened to my father was that the militiamen came in to his school, and one day, in front of perhaps the entire student body in that school with the militiamen. My father was ordered, and you had men with machine guns. My father was ordered to strip down and go down to his underwear and put on the olive green uniform of the communist government. The embarrassment that my father felt that day as the superintendent of schools in front of the student body is something that he never got over.
My grandparents are Lebanese immigrants to Cuba. So you're talking about people that were just one generation Cuban and proud to be Cuban. But their parents had all emigrated from Lebanon to Cuba and had built tremendous lives in Cuba, because Cuba was like the United States. Back in those days, if you were not politically involved or involved with the Batista government one way or the other, you just built a business. And that's what both of my grandfathers basically did in Cuba. So my parents were the beneficiaries of that life that their parents had built for them. And in just one generation, those Cuban children of these Lebanese people had to translate and put themselves here in the United States and do the same thing over again.
Of course, I cry a lot. I don't want to leave Cuba. At that time, I have 4 children, little children. And I said, my God, what I have to do with these little children out in the United States? Because I know here the life is no easy.
The first wave of exiles to the United States came in 1959. Mainly Batista supporters left, followed by the upper middle classes of Cuba, and lasted until the October missile crisis in 1962, when all travel between the United States and Cuba was suspended. President Lyndon Johnson and Fidel Castro agreed to reinstate travel in 1965, and by 1975, more than 300,000 Cubans arrived in the United States. Most Cubans stayed in Miami, but tens of thousands kept going north where there were jobs and communities were forming to welcome them. All in all, approximately 10,000 Cubans made their home in Elizabeth, New Jersey.
I was getting close to the age of 15. Had I turned 15, boys or males were not allowed to leave the country between the ages of 15 and 30 because of the military service. So had I turned 15, then the whole family would have been stuck in Cuba because they were not going to leave me behind. They were on a wait list to get a permit to leave Cuba. And they had been on that list for 5 years or so, and the permit was not coming. So they were getting anxious, so they put me on another wait list that was just on my own. So we could, if the permit for the whole family didn't come, then I would leave through Spain. There were only 2 other avenues of leaving the country, through Spain or through Mexico. Luckily, 2 weeks before I turned 15, the permit for me to leave the country arrived. I do remember in the airport, they are on the other side of a glass hall, and I could see them that they couldn't stop crying. I mean, and they were, until then, they were trying to hide their pain and their anxiety and their suffering, probably to make me feel stronger, realizing that it must have been difficult for me to. So that's the last memory that I have of Cuba. I'm seeing my parents on another, like if it was a jail or something like that, on the other side of a glass panel, crying.
To me, it was all very sad. I remember that my grandfather was nearby. He had followed us in another bus right behind, and he didn't want to say goodbye.
It was probably the happiest day of my life. I said, oh, finally we're getting out of here. Also, it was very sad because we were leaving behind our home, our friends, our grandparents, everything that we ever had. We came with the hopes that we would return in a year, 2 years, 3 years max, but things, they were so bad in Cuba that Cuba would not go on like that forever.
I didn't want my children to be brought, under the communists. In the school, they have everything. It was Fidelis, the father, and, I didn't want that. So that's what I decided to leave my country. And it wasn't easy. We couldn't get the visas, my husband and I. I get the visas, the waiver visas for my girls. My kids left in 1962. You can imagine away from my children. I thought I wasn't going to see them ever again. My husband decided that we were going to leave the country in a boat. There were 3 couples, we and 2 more couples, very good friends of us, and 4 men. And we were caught. The guy who had the boat sold us. He was with the government. So we went to jail. My husband and the other men went to Boniato jail in Oriente, and we went to Santiago de Cuba, the women. We were there August, September, October, November, and December. In December one day, they came and told us that we could go home. Just like that, we could go home. So we went home. So 2 months later, they have the trial. They were, free. Only one was condemned to 25 years in jail because he was a lieutenant of the army, at 22 years old. We came back to Holguín, our hometown, and kept on waiting for the visas. We got the visas, went to Mexico, from Mexico went to Venezuela. We were there for 9 months in Venezuela, and then came here.
So by declaring that you were leaving the country to the United States, automatically you became what Castro labeled us, as worms of the imperialist. That we were like, similar to Hitler. That Jews were rats. Well, we were worms. And obviously we became sort of like an outcast. So the whole situation became very asphyxiating. You just wait and wait and wait. You were frozen in time. It's like you were on pause. Where we're finally going to be able to continue our life. And of course, we're going to a place where, we're going to be able to have all these wonderful things that you see on TV. These all wonderful, beautiful places. We're going to live in these beautiful houses that you see on TV. I mean, the expectations were like, very, very high. And so it was very euphoric.
All the women were crying. There's a God-given thing with every human being, that where you're born is special to you. I don't know why. It just is. That's why I don't care what anybody says, but patriotism matters. It's important. And so, of course, they're all terrified. They do what they're going to be told. I mean, men crying hysterically and women sobbing.
The first instance that something wasn't right, watching my mom and dad frantically respond to what was happening to the whole family as we got to the airport. Cuban officials were literally ripping off jewelry off their bodies. They were taking everything they could of value. And my mom, of course, was pleading, that's her religious medal. Please leave it on. It's not a value. It's a religious. Everything went. All the things of value went. So all of a sudden, as a 6-year-old, I'm watching this. I'm going, boy, this doesn't look like a vacation to me. What's going on here?
As the wheels of the plane cleared the runway at the Jose Marti Airport in Havana, mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, aunts, cousins, entire lives were left behind. Those on board, their heart heavy with sadness and uncertainty, watched their green island disappear in the blue distance. For most Cubans, the first encounter with the United States was Miami. Many felt it was a temporary stop, a place to wait out the events that would lead to the inevitable fall of the Castro regime.
I remember landing in Miami, and I remember feeling really strange. This is very weird for me because we were in an airport. We were with a lot of people that we didn't know. So when I see the migrants now and migrant, we were there for only like 2 or 3 days, and that felt really terrible because it's something that I've never done before. I've never been with so many people. I was pretty much by myself growing up for 10 years. Here I am with a group of people that I don't even know. And so it felt really strange to me. It was I, my, I didn't like it. I felt very uncomfortable. I didn't like the smells. I didn't like the communal bath. I didn't like any of that.
We were given a box with a razor blade, a shaving cream, soap, a dental cream, and a toothpaste. And then we were allowed to go and meet our family that had come to pick us up or greet us. Or my cousin bought us a Coca-Cola. My brother and I could not finish it. Like we had in our mind, like you could not have a Coca-Cola all by yourself. We shared it. No, thank you. No, one is enough. We'll share it. My first memory of coming to the U.S.
At that point in my life, those two things became very important to me to this day. Smell, scent, and color is very important because I lived in a very gray world that stunk because there was nothing. There was no deodorant, there was no toothpaste, there was no soap, there was no shampoo, there was no floor cleaner. There was nothing to a country that had been the third largest economy in the world at the time. So we went to their house and I smelled dial soap for the first time. I went into the bathroom to use their bathroom. This is the 1960s. Everything is powder blue. The paint is powder blue. The tiles, the fluffy, rugs, the soap, the toilet paper. Remember colored toilet paper? Everything. I just couldn't believe it. When I picked up that soap to wash my hands, it was just the smell. Oh, the smell. Loved it. That's very vivid in my memory. I remember looking up at the sky and thinking, oh my God, this is the bluest sky I've ever seen in my life. I just came from a tropical island. The darkness that envelops that island is real. It's spiritual. It's real. And here I am in Miami going, look at the sky. Oh my gosh. And that day, my longest love affair began. It was my love affair for the U.S.
And I'll never forget, we went to a restaurant that had a blue plate special. And I love to eat out. Well, it must have started at 5 because I can still remember that blue plate special. We were hungry.
With the daily influx of refugees, Miami was becoming saturated. There were no jobs and resources were stretched thin. Cubans were encouraged to move away. Many headed north to Union City, West New York, and Elizabeth, where there were jobs and sometimes even a relative to greet them.
We flew into Newark Airport, but not the new one, the old one, the old crummy, ugly airport. And when we arrived, I was like, oh my God, I was like, where am I? Where am I flying to heaven? And here I am. Is this what heaven is like? This is Elizabeth, 1971. Oh my God, what an ugly town. It was, I was like, oh my God, what are we? It was like such a disappointment.
At first, when I came here, I was very happy first to see my brother, and that we were going to be able to buy chewing gum and the things that we didn't have in Cuba. And also we used to get the Life magazines that my father had, and we used to we'd see the pages of Life magazine all the time, and we would see this thing about the hippies going on, and so we came here thinking that everybody was going to look like John Lennon, and rimmed glasses and long hair, and we were going to be part of the move, only to find out that this country was in having major problems of their own, that Newark, New Jersey was on fire, and that we came to live in Elizabeth, New Jersey, which was a town full of chimneys and pollution, and dirty waters and ugly, and the snow that I had seen on Life magazines and ads of beautiful blonde-haired, blue-eyed people coming down the slopes of a skiing resort, was this cold winter. Snow was dirty, people were breaking ice, the cars were sliding on the ice. So they did this whole illusion that we have of coming to the land of freedom was not such a pretty land of freedom after all.
So I recall the trees with no leaves, the cold weather, but everything was, everything was marvelous. The opportunity to improve, to work, to earn money, to study. Those were things that were to us overwhelmingly. For us it was like that was our preoccupation.
Originally called Elizabethtown, Elizabeth was founded in 1664 by English settlers. In the 19th century, because of its deep harbor, it became a magnet for industry and warehouses lured by easy access to sea commerce. By the time the Cubans began arriving in 1960s and 70s, they encountered a working middle-class city of just over 100,000 people. Sprawling, leafy middle-class neighborhoods spoke of the early immigrant success and gave the Cuban newcomers a vision of possibilities. But at first, Cubans mostly settled in the working-class section of Elizabethport. There, following in the footsteps of their predecessors, they began transforming Elizabeth and themselves. Nothing seemed familiar. The Northeast was cold and dreary. There were no colors, no Spanish, no Cuban restaurants, no Cuban coffee, nothing to remind them of home.
In the fourth grade, they administered intelligence tests. And when the results came out, my parents were contacted, and my parents had to come in and speak to the principal. Because back then, the term retarded was okay. Today, it's developmentally challenged. The IQ test that I was given, I came out retarded. So the nun wanted to send me to a special school. So my father found someone who knew English and Spanish and said to the nun, "I am not retarded. I don't speak English."
I realized that it was a noble place compared to the other places that I have been to. But I found it a fascinating place because they were descendants of Germans and Irish and Poles and Jews and blacks and Puerto Ricans. And I was just fascinated by places like that, right? People from all over the planet seem to become neighbors.
Enterprising Cubans began to notice opportunities to fill the need for an experience of home. Mom-and-pop retail businesses began to sprout. A bakery that made Cuban bread, a market that sold beans and rice, a cafeteria that served thick Cuban coffee, a furniture store, an appliance store, even a jewelry store, the famed Leonardo's. Most retail concentrated on Elizabeth Avenue, the heart of what became the Cuban enclave in Elizabeth, New Jersey. But it was the hard work and the long hours worked at factories and warehouses that mostly account for their success. The Cuban experience was not unique. Other immigrants had sought to replicate the tastes and smells of home. What distinguished Cubans was their reluctance to assimilate, as they fiercely hung to their roots and their language. Many believed that their exile was temporary, thinking Castro's government could not survive and they would soon return to Cuba. We draw on the oral histories of two families, the Zeke families of Victoria de las Tunas, who arrived in 1961, and the Moya family of Bayamo, who arrived in 1970, to tell the story of how Cubans navigated the challenges of exile to build their lives in Elizabeth, transforming their community and themselves along the way.
My father just wanted to have a job right away. He knew that why he was leaving Cuba was to give us a better life, and he wanted to have a job right away. He did not want to go without being in a job. He started working at a bookbinding factory in Elizabeth. Mm-hmm. And if I remember correctly, he was there for a short period of time, and then he found a better paying factory at a pepper mill where he was cleaning the equipment. But to him, the most important thing was he had the dignity of a job, and he knew that he was making enough money. Yeah. I'll never forget, we lived on John Street. It was an Italian community, predominantly Italian. We sort of fit in and we didn't. My mom was doing okay, but it's really interesting. I was old enough to remember a lot about my mom in Cuba. And what I remember the most as a child is she had the greatest smile. And I don't remember that after she got here. It became a harder life. The joy that she had was sort of gone.
Growing up, I remember my mother crying a lot. I can't imagine what it was like for her and my father to leave, because in Cuba they were considered probably upper middle class. My father's family had the only department store in his town. My father had his own business, and my mother, like most Cubans of that day, had a nanny for each of us, someone else that cooked. Her hands, within the first 2 months of being here, were all cut open from doing dishes. 4 kids, no dishwasher. The nuns told my mother, put Crisco all over your hands to get through the winter of bathing babies and doing the dishes.
Cuba took everything from my parents, took their youth, took their ideals, but did not take their will. In fact, I think the best thing about the Cuban will is that they simply forged forward.
There were no Cubans, not when we first arrived. In that first, toward the latter part of that first year, that's when you started seeing a huge flow of Cubans. Mm-hmm. But those first 3 or 4 months, we were sort of like alone. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure there were other Cubans in Elizabeth, but there wasn't a sense of community. Everybody was sort of like just surviving, right, just finding a place to live, finding a place to work, not really seeking out other Cubans. Mm-hmm. And we also, because so many people were leaving Cuba at that same time, my father knew a lot of Cubans who moved to New York or had already moved even before the revolution. And one of them was a Cuban who had started a jewelry business in New York, a wholesale jewelry business. And he reached out to my dad, I don't know who reached out to whom, and said to my dad, you know, Leonard, you can make some extra money if you sell jewelry door to door. What's really interesting, you would think to yourself, well, why would jewelry be a big deal with the Cuban immigrant community? But if you remember what I said at the beginning, they were taking your religious medals, they were taking your wedding bands, and they wanted those again. Those were very important to Cubans. We arrived in 61. Mm-hmm. By 63, he had opened up this little tiny store in Elizabethport at a time when Elizabethport was really not a great place to be. It shows you how immigrants helped each other. My dad really was a great businessman, but he also had a great heart. He knew what he went through. He knew that he went through he lost everything. And he was able to see in all these other Cubans that were arriving, I could see himself. Mm-hmm.
I think my father was the working father. Mm-hmm. You know, we didn't really pal around at all. You know, he was working. Mm-hmm. You know, he had 4 children to support, and then Yvette was born in 64, so then we had 5. And at times, I'm going to say growing up, looking back, I kind of regret it. My dad was never there for me.
My father worked, my father provided, my father to the day he died was always taking care of everyone. It didn't matter who you were, he would help you. And he would help you in a way that nobody around him even realized or knew or saw.
He had an amazing business sense and unbelievable work ethics. He was able to buy both buildings on Elizabeth Avenue with a handshake. The Jewish business owner approached him, saw the way he worked, and offered him the buildings and said, you could pay them off in 5 years. And my father said, what do you mean I could pay them off in 5 years? They shook hands, no bank, nothing, and that's what he did. He saw that as immigrants, you gravitate towards the people that you know. One Cuban family would recommend another Cuban family, and he would issue credit to people, even though he had no money himself.
Most of the stores down Elizabeth Avenue were owned by Cubans. There was a women's store, Gina Sikh, the Sikhs, Leonardo. Leonardo was already there, and there was a bunch of Cuban Lebanese own stores there. There was another men's store, La Copa supermarket. Quite a few Salermos were already there, and they were very successful. Cubans used to shop in town. Cubans, they wouldn't go. I mean, they wouldn't go out to Woodbridge to the mall, but most of the shopping was done on Elizabeth Avenue. So it was a very thriving community.
By the 1970s, newcomers could shop Cuban, speak Spanish, and attend Cuban dances. But as they struggled with the challenges of their new lives in Elizabeth, it was still the factories and the port that provided a livelihood for the community.
We were debating whether we would come to New Jersey, where my brother had come 3 years before, or we would stay in Miami and my brother would come to Miami. So eventually the decision was made that in New Jersey there were higher wages, and that we would come to New Jersey.
I remember that day that my mother died, we thought that was the last day of the world. It was the end of the world for all of us. Somehow she being in the hospital and that overwhelming pressure and need that she commanded from that bed kept us all straight. And now we had lost her, and we had lost everything that we were living for and trying to struggle to help her survive. And when she died, it was like a total. I mean, I couldn't think of any. Probably the saddest day of my life.
Well, I lost her soon after she came. She was already sick with cancer, so it was even tougher. Then my father, alone with 5 kids, including one that was born with cerebral palsy. Already, I had graduated from high school, so I was more mature. Still working in factories. When my mother died and my father was with 5 kids, that was not enough to raise 5 kids, so we're actually receiving welfare.
I couldn't get through my head that my father could not afford to buy me a shirt. I just wanted a shirt, a simple, little, cool shirt, so I can look like every other kid in school with these Italian knit shirts that were in vogue. And my father could not afford.
So I was working at Reynolds Aluminum Company from 11 at night to 7 in the morning. Eventually, I went to Kane College because I was working as a janitor there. And some of the professors, when they saw me interested in books and reading and chess, and they became friendly with me. And they kept on insisting that I should, try to come to college.
My brother and I had to go to Cleveland, and it was a boxing school. We went there to fight it every single day of our lives.
And there's all this racial turmoil that we don't quite understand, but we obviously have to defend ourselves.
The capacity of humans to adapt is immense. We never know what we're capable of doing until we have to do it, right? Necessity is the mother of invention of adaptation.
When Cubans began settling in the United States in the early 1960s, the prevailing model of integration was assimilation, the concept of the American melting pot. But there was no such thing as Cuban Americans, African Americans, Mexican Americans, Arab Americans, or Italian Americans for that matter. There was only Americans. Bilingual education was not even a glimmer at public or private schools, and children were expected to learn English and learn it fast.
I look for my Cuban roots and developing pride for my Cuban roots. Not so much now America, and I was into listening to the old Cuban classics of Benny Moré and Celia Cruz and salsa and so forth. I kind of needed to reaffirm my Cuban heritage as opposed to adopting. So because I found the culture to be very hard to penetrate. So I kind of found the refuge in my own group, in my own culture.
Cubans were grateful to America and admired the nation that stood for freedom and opportunity. But grateful visitors as they were, many did not plan to make a permanent home in the United States. The early exiles expected that Castro was going to fall and that they would return home.
Migration is a very complex experience. When you migrate as an exile, you carry certain emotional comfort zone because we didn't came here for economic reasons or for running away from anything other than we had a dream of being free and hoping to go back. Unfortunately, we never went back, and I doubt very much I will ever will. But I will never give up my status as an exile. That's what keeps me proud, and that's why how I feel best. I don't want to be totally assimilated because I can't, even if I tried. They won't let me, or I don't want to. I have nothing to assimilate to. I'm already 61 years old, and that's all I need to know.
One of the first things that my father made very clear was that there was no return. And he said this to us: we are Americans. For us, there's no return. However, when you walk through that door, this is Cuba, which meant he was in charge. And he made that very clear. He was in charge. This was Cuba. And that we were going to be Cubans no matter where we were, but that we were going to be Americans, and that as such, this was our new home.
I think myself as a pretty lucky citizen of the world. I think as a matter of fact, I also think that exile, as painful as it has been, and that lack of sense of belonging, all of that, has also made us a lot more open. And I think in exile has also been enriching in some way, because we have been exposed to so many other cultures and so much more. And since you're not bound to a country or anything, I guess you can pick whatever you want from whatever you want and have a larger scope in life. At the same time, it's very sad not thinking that you cannot live in freedom in the place where you were born. So on one hand, I'm grateful to this country because it gave us a home and it gave us a place to raise our families and all of that. But I think of myself, I think that when I speak to people, the people that I can connect easier are the people that had a similar experience. So I guess they're called now Cuban Americans. So I think I see myself as a Cuban American.
I don't consider myself Cuban per se, but more from Bayamo, my little hometown, and where my family, where I grew up, and where all my family lived, and where we had our roots. But I subscribe, and I consider myself American. I consider myself, law-abiding, tax-paying U.S. citizen, and I defend the constitutions and the laws and the ideas, that this country is founded on, and so I have a lot of respect besides being our adopted land. So the land that gave us, the opportunity to come to a free country. So I don't know. I think it's a mixed identity. Probably is closer to some kind of a Cuban American. When I find people of my background, it's easier to connect to. We're able to joke, or there's a little innuendos in the jokes, and that things that you're not able to connect to with Anglos.
But because our relationship to the Cuban government was so difficult, our relationship to the country and that identity also became complicated. I felt Cuban, but I hated the place, actually. For example, when they were playing in sports, in Olympic Games, I always rooted against the Cuban team, and particularly rooted for the American team. Not so much because I felt particularly American yet, but because I had a great admiration for the United States and a great gratitude for the United States, and I also saw the United States as the leader of the free world, who was the only chance of defeating global communism. So I was very pro-American in that sense, right? But that admiration eventually turned into a love affair with the country too. So I don't know what I am. I'm confused about my identity.
Cubans began to leave Elizabeth and the Northeast in the 1980s, migrating back to Miami, which had been for many the original destination. By their numbers, enterprise, and sheer force of will, they had remade Miami in their own image, and the city, with its good weather and tropical flavors, was a magnet to those tired of so many winters and so much overtime.
And Elizabeth, the origins of the immigrants have changed. Now there are more Central Americans and Colombians, and that's the history of the place.
So I could experience Peru in Elizabeth, I could experience Ecuador in Elizabeth, I could experience Colombia in Elizabeth. And to me, that was fascinating. I loved it. I loved it. Then I really loved Elizabeth. I started to really develop a sense of belonging to Elizabeth. My roots were here in Elizabeth. Cuba was only now something of the past and a memory, but my roots were here.
Their legacy, I think, is a love for this country, because I will tell you this, while they were very Cuban at heart, they considered themselves to be Americans. Mm-hmm. And they always voted. So I think one of their legacies is their sense of belonging to this country and being part of this society. Mm-hmm. And their right to vote, but also an obligation to vote, which came with their American citizenship, because they held that very, very dearly. The other legacy was a sense of not being afraid to take a risk. That was foremost. You tried and you tried and you tried until you got it right, but you were not a quitter. And that is a very strong legacy, I think, that they have instilled in us, and in all four of us. The other part of it is education. I think they strongly believed in being educated. And my mother used to say, los papelitos hablan. She would say, paper talks. And what she meant by that was credentials are important.
What they had to go through was incredibly difficult, but they knew that if they worked, they were living in the best country in the world, and they were going to be able to raise me in a democracy, and that we would be free and we would not be in a communist country.
I really believe it is an example of tenacity, of not wallowing in what was, understanding what they had, and recognizing that they wanted it again because it had been snatched from them. But personally, it's that feeling of a community who came here, assimilated, tried very hard to become good, decent Americans. This is my home.
So definitely today, the Hispanic community has a very high profile politically, more even beyond our imagination. And obviously that translates into employment opportunities, business opportunities, and they kind of like feed each other. The real pioneers were more the generation of my parents, but they really get to see the fruit. They were more like Moses, they never got to see the promised land. He stayed in the desert. And eventually we were the ones that pretty much got to the promised land, and obviously we opened opportunities for all the other Hispanics, because it was a lot easier for them than was for us back in the early 60s, when nobody spoke Spanish, and it was a totally different mindset in town. But I think at the end, it has a happy ending, because the opportunities were there. So the hope was not unfounded. The hope was there. And that's what America is about. It's about hope. It's about opportunity. That's the rest is up to you. All the groups have gone through the same pains, or even worse pains than we did, because that's what immigration is about. It's pain and hope. Pain and hope. It's that balance of pain and hope.